Hi, everybody. Welcome to our Facebook video today. Today, we're going to talk a little bit more about grief. We touched on it a few weeks ago, but just wanted to explore some of the terms that we're hearing more frequently. And I'm joined today by Susan Coale, who is the director of the Chesapeake Life Center at Hospice of the Chesapeake. So, Susan, thanks for coming via Zoom and talking to me today.
Very happy to be here.
So, let's start with grief, the overall sort of concept of and definition, I guess, of what grief and loss, what it is. What is it?
I know that traditionally we think of grief associated with a death loss, and it's that whole constellation of feelings that come when we've lost someone that we love. Mm-hmm. In actuality, grief is much bigger than that. Grief happens anytime we experience a loss, and really anytime we experience a change. So it's possible that we even experience good changes and have a sense of grief that goes with them. Okay. It might be a graduation where, that's a great big celebration. Right. And the way life was, the people we associate with, the structure that we have, changes. So there may be a feeling of grief that goes with that. Certainly varies in intensity with what the change is and how deep the losses associated with it are. But to have a sense of grief, a sense of loss, even in the midst of a happy change, is such a normal thing.
And right now, everything we're feeling is change. Everything has changed, and it continues to change.
Yes, right now with COVID-19, for most people, nearly every aspect of their life has been impacted, has been changed. And so there are a lot of feelings of grief, of sadness and uncertainty, of anxiety, of living in that space of just not knowing, am I taking enough precautions to keep myself healthy, not knowing how long is this going to last, not knowing how we will be afterwards, because we will be different. Our lives will be different because of it. So there's a lot of grief happening right now.
So I know I'm seeing in social media and on the news a lot of terms that are associated with grief. So like one of them I've seen is anticipatory grief. Can you explain a little bit what that is, what the definition of that is?
Sure. Anticipatory grief is that collection of feelings that we experience in preparation for a loss that we're expecting. And in anticipation, really, is what it is. And so there's certainly, in day-to-day life, when we're preparing, that we know that someone we care about is going to die, we anticipate, we sort of try it on, we rehearse it, and to kind of get ourselves a little bit ready about what's it actually going to be like when this person is gone. Now in COVID-19, I think what makes the anticipatory grief even more challenging is that we're getting ready for something, but we're not exactly sure what.
Right.
We know that everything is going to be changed, everything is going to be different, and yet we don't know quite what that's going to be. So we find ourselves thinking about what's it going to be like if someone we're close to dies, or if they don't, or if we're on telework for months and months and months, or what will graduation, what will school. I mean, there's so many things that we're anticipating.
Right.
But we don't know what.
If someone we know gets sick, if we get sick, I'm sure that's all sort of.
All of that, yes.
So I've also seen the term ambiguous. So how does ambiguous grief, can you explain a little bit what that is?
Again, think about the term ambiguity. Something is a little this and a little that. So when we talk about ambiguous loss, there are sort of two types of it. We talk about when a person is physically present but emotionally absent, or the other way around, when they're very emotionally present in our lives, but physically absent. And what we're finding with social distancing, which I really prefer to phrase as physical distancing, because we still very much need to be socially connected with people. But with the physical distancing, folks are very emotionally present in our lives, but they're not as physically present as they might have ordinarily been.
Yeah.
Even really simple things, like for those of us who live nearby other family members, that we don't see them, we don't have that physical engagement in their life. We don't share hugs, and so there's that ambiguity. Well, I don't really need to grieve that she's not here,
Right.
but yet there is that sense of grief that, yep, she's not. You don't share things in that same way.
Yeah, and it's almost like hard to put your finger on it, sort of thing. Like it just sort of feels like, something's not right, but
Yes, and isn't that the essence of ambiguity?
Absolutely.
Something is just not right. Things don't quite fit. They're sort of at an angle.
So the other phrase that I've seen is collective grief. So can you give a little bit of an explanation for what that means?
I think collective grief is, if you want a beautiful illustration of collective grief, COVID-19 is it. Because everyone across the society is feeling it, even all around the world, that things have shifted, things have changed. Work situations are different. Children are being schooled at home. Our usual means of self-care are not available to us because they so often require a physical closeness. And so the collectiveness of it is that we're all feeling it. We're all feeling it in very different ways. Mm-hmm. It's still unique. Back to our basic definition of grief. Grief is unique to each person, and it's universal that we all feel it. Well, the same is true here. We're each experiencing this collective grief within this COVID-19 crisis. And we're each experiencing it differently as it impacts our own personal lives.
Right.
It's really important when people are together sharing their feelings of loss and grief, that there's not a comparison. Nobody's grief or loss is better than another's, right, or worse. They're different. Yes, it is a different kind of loss if someone you care about dies of COVID-19. That's a very different loss than those who are experiencing the loss of an expected graduation or prom or events, a wedding. There's a grief there too. It's not to be compared. Right. It's just, for so much of this, we just need to acknowledge that it exists, right, and that it's real and valid.
Got it. So the last term that I've seen is complicated grief. So can you give a little bit of an explanation what that is referring to?
Traditionally, in our work with grieving people, complicated grief is a term used to describe people who sort of get stuck, who don't move through their grief in a way that might be expected, or who are more debilitated for a longer period of time. And there are a number of things that can make one's grief process more complicated. COVID-19 is adding to that list of complications for people. It's creating situations in which family members are unable to be with their loved one as their loved one dies. Now, that's whether they have COVID-19 or whether they're dying of some other natural cause. If their loved one is in a hospital or in a skilled nursing care facility, many facilities are just not letting people in. Right. So that variation from how things should be or normally would be is what complicating factor. Another thing that is happening is that for folks who lose a loved one, again, to any cause, they're not permitted legally to engage in the very rituals and traditions that often bring comfort. We're not gathering in homes to cry together and hug together and be physically close like we would be able to. If there's able to be a funeral or a traditional service, that's impacted by the fact that a gathering must be limited to 10 people.
Right.
And how much difficulty and stress does that add to an already difficult situation?
Right.
So there's just a lot about the impact of COVID-19 on top of very normal and natural death and dying processes that's going to make it more complicated, more difficult for our grievers to come to terms with not being with my loved one when they died, and not being able to celebrate their life or remember them in the way that they perhaps wanted and I perhaps promised.
Right.
That I can't do. So that's where the complications come.
Got it. And all these different terms, someone could experience all these different types of grief, correct? Like it's not just one track for one.
Right.
Person. It kind of can, all right. So all these terms could apply to a person at different times of day or
yep,
experience.
very much so.
Okay. So what would you say some suggestions might be just overall during this time period while we're all experiencing, you know, in our own way, the different types of loss? Is there something that, you know, might be helpful? You said acknowledging it, like that's.
Absolutely. I think that's the very first thing, is to acknowledge that this is different.
Yeah.
And it's important that we recognize that we give ourselves permission to be feeling all of these feelings, that we can be compassionate with ourselves.
Right.
Yes, this is different. This is harder. And I can't hold myself to the same expectation. To be kind and compassionate to yourself and to those around you is just so important. Not setting some standard that you should be performing at a particular level or being productive in particular ways. It's just not helpful. There's enough stress and strain. So I think that's an important place to start. The other thing is, I think when situations feel so out of control, when there's so little that we can do, to sort of narrow our focus a little bit and say, okay, what can I do?
Right.
What can I control? And so much of that comes down to taking care of ourselves. On the one hand, no, a lot of things, if you've been accustomed to, you know, going to a gym or, you know, hanging out with a bunch of friends
Right.
In the evening, you know, those things are not available to us. But the very simple, basic, drinking water every day, eating nutritious food, and knowing that when we're stressed like this is when our brain sort of wants those feel-good chemicals, and so there's a big pull towards sugar and unhealthy food. But what your body really craves and really needs at this point is nutritious, healthy food, and to do what you can to give it that.
Right.
Get adequate sleep. And one of the reasons why I prefer the term physical distancing to social distancing is it is important. What a gift that we have all this technology. Do reach out to people to stay connected socially. It is different than usual, but it still matters. I notice, and I've had friends say to me how much better I feel after I've been in touch with someone, just seeing their face.
Right.
It matters.
Yeah.
It helps. And at the same time, because so much of that is on social media,
Right.
to limit, you know, everywhere you go, whatever kind of screen you're on, from television to computer to phone to iPad, it's all COVID-19. It's really important to take a break.
Right.
Do you need certain information in order to be safe? Yes. Acknowledge that, get that, and then go to other things. distract yourself,
Don't,
do
don't
things.
saturate yourself.
Yes, don't.
Marinate
Yes.
in it, yeah.
And we all have that sort of that tipping point when we've just, it's just too much. And now it just feels too heavy and too overwhelming.
Right.
So you know where that is. Stop before you get to that point.
Okay.
So that sometimes what you're doing is managing things through this crisis. And sometimes what you're doing is you're engaging in that which soothes you and restores you and makes you happy and makes you laugh.
Right. Right.
So I spend a lot more time going to silly things on YouTube than I ever have in my life.
That's awesome. Just sort of, yeah, it's a good distraction, a good way to sort of, make.
Yeah. And laughter
Yeah.
has a wonderful physical healing response in our bodies.
Right. What about any other resources or recommendations that you might be able to make online if somebody does want to look into more information about any of these topics that we talked about?
Well, the other thing I would suggest for people as much as possible is go outside, go for a walk. Notice spring is happening. In the midst of all this, when everything has changed, spring is happening and it's beautiful. And if you can't go out there to experience it, to look for those beautiful pictures that just to engage with that kind of, even just visually on your screen helps. What's Your Grief has some very good articles about ambiguous loss and other kinds of grief that I would recommend. And David Kessler has several resources available on grief and the impact of COVID-19 at grief.com.
Okay, awesome, awesome. And in our Facebook, we'll be sure to include those links so folks can can check those out as well. Susan, thanks. Was there anything else that you wanted to mention?
No, just to mention that the professionals at Chesapeake Life Center are still here, recognizing there's still grief and loss to be dealt with, and that I hope that the community sees us as a resource as well.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks so much for your time. I also want to thank the John and Cathy Belcher Institute for their generous support of the community education programs at Hospice of the Chesapeake. And thank you guys for watching.